Great. Hello, everybody. Thanks again for those that joined on time, and for any new entrants, thank you also for joining us. My name is Ben Lewis. I'm going to be your host today. We're going to be speaking about how you can fast track your application delivery, specifically for healthcare providers. We, Load Balancer, are best known for load balancing, who would have thought, but we're going to cover a number of other topics because, as the title says, it's not all about the nines. I'm joined today by two of my esteemed colleagues, Aaron West, who heads up our solutions engineering team.
Hi there, everyone.
Thanks, Aaron. And James Loveday, who is a healthcare sales specialist.
Hello, everybody.
Thanks, gents. So, as I touched on, we're going to talk about a number of areas, not just focusing on availability, even though that's what load balancers are best known for. We're going to go through a number of the areas that we have worked with partners and end users in the healthcare space, and cover the topics that you see on the screen. We would like you to ask questions as we go along. There is a Q&A button on the Zoom menu bar, so please do use that. Ask any questions. We are going to save those for the end, but please ask. We'll get to all of them at the end of the session. So that's the housekeeping bits done. Let's get into it. Said this already. It's not just about the nines. There are a number of other areas. I think, James, you've got some thoughts on some of these areas. So if you want to take things away.
Absolutely, Ben. Thanks. There are a number of elements, as the slide suggests. In healthcare, IT technicians, IT infrastructure managers are thinking about how to modernize their infrastructure. They're thinking about their legacy applications, what they'll be adding in the future, but also how that data is managed and how all of those disparate systems will connect together in a secure manner that protects the patient, protects their information.
Great. Okay. Aaron, have you got anything to add here?
I mean, the main thing I would say is, as the slide suggests, it's not all about the nines. It's about what we can do to help you, whether it be on-premise, in the cloud, in the move to the cloud. And it's about how we can work with both your legacy applications and as well as the sort of more modern applications that are more designed for those cloud experiences.
Great. And I think it's always interesting with these things to focus on what's important to end customers. So I guess it'd be great to hear your thoughts on some of the challenges that our partners and customers face today.
Yeah. So, generally, what we're seeing in terms of challenges is massive amounts of data growth being, I would say, the primary one. So a lot of people probably start their current journey to the cloud because they're looking at long-term storage of archived data. It's very common to throw that infrequently accessed data into the cloud where it's very well protected and you can still get it back when you need it. Obviously, I think other areas that are important is the complexity of infrastructure on premises and maintaining staff to maintain that. One of the benefits of cloud, and it's not to say that there isn't a shortage gap in cloud too, but because we're no longer having to get down in the depths of the infrastructure, we don't need to have those hardcore switch guys and router guys to deal with all of the low-level stuff that we have in our own data centers.
Yeah, great. And one of the things that always jumps out to me around cloud is the debate around costs. We know that there's a real push within the healthcare space to manage and control costs. But yeah, there are definitely areas where cloud can help with that, and other areas where it doesn't always. So we'll get into that a little bit as we go further through. I guess, again, just in terms of framing, it'd be really good to look at some of the guiding principles that healthcare organisations are focused on.
I can take that, Ben. So really, the core focus here is about the experience of the patient, improving their outcomes, experience of the clinicians that are working within the hospital or even outside the hospital. So really putting those users' needs first. That really centers around that quadruple aim: better outcomes, improved clinician experience. There's a real drive, as we touched upon right at the beginning, to modernize, to build modular systems that are not segregated, can really build upon each other, make those systems talk to each other in a manner that means that data is accessible, it's made useful. Of course, the patient's privacy is important from protecting their information perspective. I guess the biggest push we've seen, particularly with COVID, is moving care outside the hospital, so away from the source of disease and, into the home, into remote centres to, really spread risk and make sure that patients receive care wherever they are. So that's a really interesting push that we've seen, not just from COVID, but just in modernising healthcare. And then really that. Go ahead, Ben.
So I hear a lot of talk about healthcare providers having a cloud-first approach. It'd just be really interesting to hear your thoughts on why you think that's such a driver and why you think that's so important at the moment.
Yes, I think the main drivers are really using those resources that without the need to invest in them. So you've got a large amount of high-performance compute resources, a very large amount of storage that can grow exponentially. So it's really leveraging those benefits, but also coming back to that moving care outside the hospital, by allowing users to access that information from anywhere, that really helps those healthcare providers to realize the benefits of cloud. Okay,
great. And again, one of my other observations, and the closer to the healthcare space and more expert than I am, but in the research we were doing in the build-up out at me was these guiding principles seem to be pretty common globally, although here in the UK, where we're based, you can probably tell by our accents, we often focus on the NHS, the National Health Service, but it was really, really interesting to see that these principles exist in most geographies, most countries around the world. So yeah, that was an interesting one for me. I guess the other piece that always jumps out at me for cloud is long gone are the days when anybody thought that the right thing, or it was even possible to do a great big bang approach, will move everything tomorrow. So always interesting to debate, how you prioritize between short, medium and long-term aims. So Aaron, have you got some thoughts there?
Yeah, so I mean, from my point of view, you tackle in the short term the obvious stuff, the easy stuff, right? So as we mentioned already, data is a good one. We often will have a scenario where we want the frequently accessed data to be close to the clinician, so it's easy to view and easy to get and performance. But equally, as I mentioned earlier, we've got the long-term storage requirements of data between adults and children. I know that children in particular, those requirements to store data can be sort of 15 years plus. You might not frequently need to be accessing that data. So being able to push that data up to the cloud is very, very useful. I think other reasons to do it would be if you've already got a modern application that's already suits breaking up into smaller components and would suit moving to the cloud, it will probably be cheaper to run because you can spin services up and down as they're needed throughout the day. And I think another great thing, something that James touched upon, is the amount of compute resources that are just at your fingertips ready to use. So with services like AI becoming more and more important, that again to me is a thing that you would probably take advantage of in the shorter term. Moving towards the midterm, I think that's when you start looking at potentially refactoring some of the easier to do so applications again, but stuff that might need some work and some thought, and then start moving over more and more services and data. A good thing I think at this stage is to look at your web applications, because typically web applications like viewing applications will be quite simple to move because they suit that sort of cloud environment. And all the services and stuff like GSLBs and layer 7 load balancers will be able to work with that data quite well. And then longer term, this is where we're going to start looking at the harder stuff to move, right? And sometimes you won't want to move some of the harder stuff. There is an argument to keep it local and have, maybe multi-site / multi-cloud environments that utilize the best place for the applications in question. So but if you are really looking to move everything towards the cloud, then at this point, you might want to look at replacing some of your older applications with newer applications that would better suit that environment. So I do think it's a staged approach, and it isn't a big bang. And, unless, of course, you're not worried about the cost, which, as we saw on an earlier slide, usually is a key component of why people are doing this.
I think that's
really
right,
Aaron. Go ahead, James.
From a cost perspective, I think it's an interesting point. You've touched upon, that application readiness and how, in the short term, you might move some of the simpler workloads to cloud, and over time it requires more decision making about how you manage those workloads. But in general, I think cost is a big consideration, and how to manage that cost can be challenging at the outset to work out really what your costs are going to look like over the longer term. So a phased approach is probably for most vendors the sensible option, because it will allow them to assess over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that takes us nicely into, cloud is not a simple one decision, we're going all in tomorrow. That's just not reality. There are a number of other areas that would impact your thoughts around cloud. And James, you rightly just touched on cost being a major one of those there. But again, we can see there are a number of other areas. And I know, Aaron, you're always keen to talk about recovery time and recovery point objectives.
Of course. I'll start on the compliance thing, though, actually. One of the things that I'm quite happy with the improvements in recent clouds is that they're having more points of presences around the world, which is making it easier to justify you moving this important data up into the cloud in a local location. I mean, it used to be an issue potentially for you to have to store your data in the US if you were a European hospital or something like that. But as more and more of these locations are opening up in all the major clouds, that's helping with the compliance side. And another thing to mention is certainly AWS, and I'm sure the other vendors do as well, actually provide HIPAA compliance kind of as part of the way they run their services. So you can take advantage and sort of piggyback off the back of some of their compliances that are already in place. I think we've touched on cost quite a bit. So, one of the benefits is cost, but let's move on to impact on users. So again, I think this is realistically around how you can improve performance of the applications. You've got a lot of remote workers these days, not just due to the recent crisis in the world, but generally I think that as constraints have been put in place in terms of how many skilled people there are to look at these images and process these images, it's become more and more important to have remote access to all these things. And as you do that, moving it out to the cloud is definitely an important way of getting that performance to the users. Ben, you brought up RTO and RPO, of course, which, as we know, is recovery point objective and recovery time objective. That's all about your backups and how much data you're kind of willing to lose before getting the system back up and running. So how often do you snapshot? How often do you take backups? And recovery time is more about how long you're willing for the service to be down. And I think in clinical workloads, that's something we're trying to avoid. It might not all be about the nines, but it can be to a certain extent. It's very important that system is available if you're caught in a road traffic accident at midnight and you're taken to your local hospital. The last thing you would want to hear is that nobody can review your images because the system is down, right? And I think just lastly, touching on the final point there is the skills. I mean, there's two sides of that argument. I mentioned earlier that infrastructure skills tends to be less because the cloud has extrapolated that away from us. Generally, your application specialists are the people that will be working in cloud environments, and I think that they're generally easier to maintain those skill sets. Not to say it won't be expensive to find the right people, but yeah, it's making IT easier in theory in the cloud.
Yeah, I think that's one that often gets overlooked, Aaron, because I think you're absolutely right. You've got, particularly if you've got a heavy on-premises mode of operation today, you have skills used to supporting that. It's not to say that they're not very capable people that can't learn how to deploy and run services in the cloud, but it is a different way of doing things and a different set of skill sets and often a different set of operational procedures. So there's definitely a really important consideration there around how and when you train your people, because just buying in skills is definitely the expensive way to do it. So it'd be great to have a think about some of the workloads, and I think we've talked quite a bit about the cloud storage piece, so perhaps we skip over that one. But James, I know you had some quite interesting stories, particularly around use of AI and things like that, and how that impacts patient outcomes, as you were talking about a little bit earlier. Would you give us some sort of colour and thought around that?
Sure. I think the biggest driver in interoperability is taking patient information and making it useful to things like high performance computing and AI. What does that mean in reality right now? It means that actually those applications, those intelligent services are supporting the decisions that clinicians are making. So, they'll look at thousands of images of patients over 50 with a certain type of illness and make a decision that backs what the clinician is thinking. AI today is not at the point where it's making decisions on our behalf. There's an optimistic view that over time it will be able to do that. But I think, that's a big driver for making use of not just the large amounts of data storage, so getting all of that patient information and metadata up into the cloud, but making use of those high performance compute resources to actually help make decisions. So, we're finding, as I said, where clinicians are moving outside the hospital, the AI is actually backing that. So 1 or 2 people can diagnose a particular illness, and then the AI will agree or disagree on the basis of the information that it has to feed off of.
Yeah, this is the stuff I really love. I'm a bit of a geek at heart, and I just love seeing where technology makes a real difference, and that's a brilliant example of where things like AI can really make a difference to human beings, as opposed to just having fancy apps and games on your phone, which are nice, but not quite the same as saving lives. No, great, really, really interesting. So I think the thing that always jumps out to me, though, is, what's load balancing got to do with any of this? We keep saying it's not just about the 9, so probably a good time for us to start talking about, where does load balancing play in all of this? Because I think, most people know that cloud is a direction of travel for healthcare organisations. So, how do we impact that? How can we help?
I'll jump in on that one. In terms of your migration plans to the cloud, well, first of all, I think it's worth mentioning that many of these applications traditionally will already be load balanced in your data centers. So you're already in a position where you have an application that you're probably using, and it's probably already HA. So you need to move that to the cloud. And one of the first things you might want to do is start using that load balancer, or one like ours, to route certain traffic load and workloads to the cloud. So you're going to migrate data across. And we mentioned earlier things like your long-term storage and things like that. So we could have advanced rules that were saying if it comes from a certain source IP address, or even calling AE title in some cases, we could cherry pick that traffic and send it off to the cloud or to an AI or to something else. So we can act as a bit of a switch, if you will, to fail over that data from one place to another. We can also help, as part of doing that, scale up migration by having multiple real servers behind a virtual service that we're then using to migrate the data to. So we can help the performance of the migration, so to speak.
I think that's an important one, Aaron. Just on the migration piece, I think that's a really important consideration, because in many cases it's a one-time event, right? So that is a large amount of data that's atypical, that's volumes above what a normal day-to-day amount of traffic would look like. So the need to optimize there, and where load balancing really helps, I think, is important, and you've rightly called that out.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that we find quite a lot when people are moving from one system to another. I've seen cases where they've actually had a larger license from us temporarily in order to facilitate that move and just pumping as much data through as humanly possible. So definitely something worth talking about. I think the other thing is, of course, we've got GSLB services, which can be really helpful in terms of having services across multiple locations, whether they be clouds or multiple DCs. So you can aim for a kind of hybrid approach where you're using a bit of both. Local fast servers that are in the hospital, archives up in the cloud, AIs that are up in the cloud, and the load balancer can be the linchpin between all of these disparate systems.
Okay, brilliant. So we've touched on some of the technical and operational areas that we can help there. It'd be really interesting to explore how those sort of interoperability features actually make a difference. So James, have you got something that you'd like to talk about there?
Yeah, I think we've touched on interoperability as really centering around the patient, around that information. So be it images, be it data that really talks about the patient in isolation. But you spread that across the population and you build up a really big picture of health and how you can use that information to improve standards of healthcare. So access to that information is really important, and making sure that all these disparate systems, whether it's imaging or health records or others, are all able to talk to each other. Why? Because coordination of care across a different setting, that's that first point. That just means access to that information from anywhere. So if it's care in the home or any other setting, that is important to the patient. I can access my health records on my phone and get my test results. It's important to a clinician if they need to look up their history while they're taking care of them in a different setting, then that's equally important. AI, again, we're talking about that decision support piece. So using all of that important data to back clinical decisions. I don't need to say any more on that. And then lastly, again, it's about reduced administration burden and also making sure that information's not lost. It's extreme, but we are looking at patient outcomes here. And if it's the difference between getting a result in time and being able to support that patient with drug discovery or just simply determining the way forward in terms of their care, that's equally important. And then the benefit that comes beyond that is clinician experience. So just not making it difficult for clinicians, for radiologists, for pathologists, and other ologists to work day to day without being burnt out.
Great stuff. Yeah, and I mean this is the bit that really matters, isn't it? This is what's the point of it, or why does it matter? And these are the bits I think that talk to those guiding principles that we touched on a little bit earlier. I think Aaron was going to actually of the real world, how we've been involved in healthcare deployments today and where the load balancers have made a real difference, because it's always interesting to see that or hear that in real terms.
Yeah, definitely. So, we've been involved in many deployments across the world. One of the ones that sticks in my head, although it's quite an old one now, would be what we did in one of the major London hospital trusts here in the UK. So it'll be 6 or 7 years ago now, but we helped them to realise a fully highly available system across 3 data centres within London. It was all part of a large MetroNet network deployment across the city. And, we had a very cool sort of design where we had a head-in one of their data center locations, in which we actually used a giant sort of layer 7 reverse proxy to handle all of the traffic being distributed across the sort of main hospital-based data centers. And then within each of those data centers, we had local load balancers that were handling the various types of traffic, whether it be XDS, DICOM, HL7, all these different protocols that were being load balanced across the system. It's been in place for a long time now, and it's created a very highly available system that I'm not aware of any major outages over the last 6 or 7 years. It was a very interesting project to be part of, and it really, started myself realizing a bit more how specialist really the whole healthcare environment is. It's very much different, I think, and the same to other areas of IT. But you do need to start learning the lingo, and you do need to understand how important all these systems are. And as we, as a company, and myself as an engineer, has gained more and more knowledge, hopefully we've got ourselves into a better position to be able to help you guys with the sort of problems that you might be seeing as you move stuff to the cloud.
Great, thanks, Aaron. I think one of the things that I see a lot talking about our cloud capabilities and the cloud in general, I sometimes go against the grain a bit, because I'm supposed to be the #1 advocate of cloud and go, cloud is the answer to everything. But I find myself having an internal battle where I actually believe that hybrid is and will always be the dominant approach. And I think that, again, is an area where we really have something to add. And Aaron, I know you can get into the more technical specifics of this, but one of the things that comes across really strongly in conversations that I have around our capability in the main hyperscale cloud providers is people love the fact that our product is essentially the same, whether it's on premises in your own data center, whether it's in AWS, Azure, Google, doesn't really matter. How you operate your load balancers and configure them is the same. And that's actually a massive bonus, because that does help with that hybrid mode of operation. And as people are talking more and more about multi-cloud, you begin to make those things again a little bit more of a realism rather than a dream for the future. And actually, on this next slide, I'm gonna jump in and talk straight about points 5 and 6 because I've already started waffling around those areas. So again, Aaron, you talked a bit about how load balancers can help us to migrate workloads and applications into the cloud, and of course they can help you repatriate. So we have seen examples where organizations have moved certain services to the cloud, and for one reason or another, whether it's cost, whether it's just that particular application doesn't perform as they thought it would in the cloud, have had to repatriate back to an on-premises environment or perhaps into a service provider. We've seen examples where the migration just hasn't quite gone as planned, and there's a sort of a fail-back scenario. So we've definitely got a lot of value to add there. And then that comes into, and the piece I was just talking about around hybrid and multi-cloud, future-proofing. This is a massive conversation because this becomes a commercial consideration as much as it is a technical or operational consideration. Nobody likes this idea of lock-in. What if we say, right, we've chosen Microsoft Azure, we're going to move everything to Azure. Oh no, now they've got us, and it's very difficult to migrate out again. The load balancers can actually help with that because we enable you to take your workloads and move your traffic to wherever it needs to be. So those are my thoughts on 5 and 6. James, do you want to jump in on a couple of these?
Yeah, I think that one of the major benefits that in point 6 is that flexibility of license, isn't it? So it's the ability to move those workloads without thinking about penalties for moving your load balancing workloads to either a cloud, a multi-cloud, or your own data center. So that's really important. I think a standout one is the 3 and 4 points of it is about availability and it is about uptime. It does matter that your services are available all the time, and that is intelligent design, but it's also having load balancing that makes those intelligent decisions about how your workloads are performing. It informs scalability as well in making sure that heavily loaded services are pushed over to other servers in the cluster. So that is one of the core tenets of load balancing is availability, closely followed by scalability.
I'd say, just adding on to the end of that, James and Ben, I think one thing from an engineering point of view that really sticks in my mind when you're thinking about de-risking is often, us engineers, we've solved the problem. Now, the classic one maybe, I'll talk about a real one, DICOM. A common issue might be that you've got clients that are talking to your PAC system, and they're speaking to that PAC system on a specific IP. Now, when they retrieve data back and they ask for an image to be returned to them, often what happens is with many DICOM systems, I've seen this across many vendors, is that they'll need us to translate the traffic so that when it comes back to the client, it comes from the same virtual service IP address that it was talking to earlier, not from the actual real server's true IP, because that traffic would be unrelated and therefore dropped. Now, when you've solved these problems on premise with a hardware or virtual load balancer, your first issue you're going to have is moving this up to the cloud and resolving it again, right? Which becomes much more complicated. With us or with someone like us, you can just take your existing solution and move it up there. Equally, when you fail back and you decide that actually maybe that didn't work out, then you take the solution back down again with all of these engineering points that we've already solved moving with us. So it's very powerful, so you don't have to re-architect and re-engineer literally everything when your CIO comes along and says, hey, we need to move that app to the cloud.
Yeah,
so
completely agree.
I think that's an important point.
I agree, and I think that's really, speaks volumes about the decision-making process when you're architecting these solutions and why perhaps you need to choose a fully featured true load balancer versus maybe a cloud-native one where it's designed with one very specific job in mind. It might be, more web content-based at layer 7. It might be, simpler load balancing fast at layer 4. It won't support all of the decisions that you need to make. And I think with these applications, even in a radiology workflow, for example, you're managing imaging workloads, you're managing non-imaging data with HL7, you might be plugging into other services where, something cloud native just won't be a good fit out of the box. And like you said, Aaron, it doesn't behave in the same way that it would if it was just simply deployed in your own data centers. So from a de-risking perspective, we're looking at that as, how do we make it simpler to move without any of the challenges that maybe a cloud native load balanced architecture would bring.
Yeah, great. So I think, would it be fair to say, gents, that one of the biggest reasons you would use load balance, and particularly our load balancers in the cloud, is around risk management, risk mitigation?
I think so, definitely that, and simplicity of maintenance. We've touched upon before how there's different skills that would be required for on-premise and looking after routers and switches and things like that, different skills that would be required for specific cloud environments. One of the things that's great about our appliance, and we get this all the time in terms of feedback, is that you don't need to be a network engineer to administer our appliance. So you're also de-risking it from a complexity point of view. It's point and click, it's got a beautiful, simple to use web UI, and anyone with a decent amount of technical experience can be brought up to speed to use our LB. It's not like you need to write code or do complex command line things like you might need to on other appliances. So I think a massive de-risk is the simplification.
Yeah, I think that really ties in nicely to the piece we were talking about earlier around skills. And if you are changing your operating model and having to learn new things, one less thing to learn or one easy thing to learn has got to be a big benefit. So I think we've probably talked quite a bit about de-risking, and we're coming towards the end of the webinar now. So just a quick little bit about us, Loadbalancer.org. So we've been around for over 20 years. We are experts in healthcare. You can see on the slide some of the sort of large well-known vendors in the space that we work with on a regular basis. So these are all organizations that we have validated solutions in place with. I think a thing that we're incredibly proud of and we love to talk about is our open source heritage. So I know Aaron and his team in particular do a huge amount and give a lot back to the open source community. I think it just talks a little bit about us as an organization and our modus operandi, if you like. We're very, very engineering led, but we're also about kind of goodness within the technical community. I mean, Aaron, I don't know if you wanted to add a little bit to that.
Only to say that, yeah, we are unashamedly built upon open source software. I would say that most middle market load balancers probably are. Whether they tell you about it is another matter. We certainly do. And as Ben said, we're proud to contribute back to the community where we can on that stuff. I think the important thing about open source software is the massive amount of peer review that it gets. There's an argument for proprietary, there's an argument for open source. I am definitely myself a supporter, as long as it's backed by enterprise grade support. And, that's definitely an area that we major in.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Aaron. So I guess we get into, why would you work with us? So hopefully some of it's come through in the webinar today, some of the reasons that we've talked about. We've definitely touched around easy to use, configure and manage, and what that means for your skills capability, particularly if you're in a changing environment. The freedom license is a really, really interesting concept. Again, this is more of a commercial construct, but it's really, really important. A lot of vendors out there, if you're trying to move from an on-premises to a cloud environment or vice versa, every time you do something different, it's a whole new set of license costs. It's not how we operate. Once you've bought your licenses from us, you can take them with you. So it's a thing that for a long time it's just the way we are. But actually, when we get into conversations, customers tell us that that's really, really powerful, because it goes back to that future-proofing and allowing organizations to adapt and change and make the decisions they need without feeling like there's going to be a financial penalty for doing so. Again, I think we've touched on a lot of these areas, but I don't know, James, Aaron, if there's anything else that you guys want to chip in with that you think is really important before we close out and go to the Q&A?
One thing, and that is that I would say, why us? Come and talk to us and find out. I think that we're very approachable. We love to hear about technical challenges that you might be facing. We love to get involved. And even if sometimes we have to turn around and say it's not something we can help with, or even redirect you towards someone that can, we're still very happy to have those conversations.
Yeah, and actually on that one, I'm not throwing Aaron under the bus for this. He will absolutely thank me for saying it. He absolutely loves people that come to him and his team with something really, really hard and say, we've tried all sorts of different ways and we've talked to this vendor and that vendor and we're really struggling with this. Nothing gets Aaron and his team more excited than those sorts of conversations. and normally a sales guy would get hit very hard around the head by a technical person for saying that, but we're actually together in the same room, and I know he's not going to hit me. So yeah, there we go. There's a nice note to finish on as we go into the question and answer section. I'm not going to get hit. So we've got a couple of questions already in the Q&A. So let's kick off with those.
So the first one of those, the first question is, how hard is it to migrate my configuration from a virtual appliance to the cloud? Aaron, I think that might be a good one for you.
Yeah, certainly. Basically, we have an XML which contains all the common config. This can be exported and this can be imported into other appliances. Obviously, with the cloud, there's different networking limitations, different cloud environments that you might use. So I'd say reach out to our support team, who will be certainly happy to help with that.
Great, thank you. And then a follow-up, I think it's quite closely related to that. So is the appliance the same on virtual as on cloud? Will I have a big learning curve?
Yeah, our web UI is common across all of our versions of our appliance, whether it be hardware or cloud or virtual. You might find, like in our AWS image, there's a special AWS menu item, which is just to allow the interaction with the API and to assign IPs and things like that, specifically in the cloud. So yeah, it's common across all things. It makes it much easier to work with, and that's one of the boons of our product, frankly.
Brilliant, thank you. I think the next one is slightly more commercially focused, so I'll fire this one at James. With such large amounts of image data, do cloud-related costs make a move to the cloud too expensive? Do you suggest that only rarely accessed data is moved?
I think both are true. I think there's an element of cost management to any cloud strategy. So in the short term, it's probably best to think about moving those workloads that are not frequently accessed and not likely to incur significant costs. However, over time, those workloads will move, and part of it is cost management and managing those application pools. So the load balancer does a really good job of that. It performs advanced health checking. It has content steering so that you can make sure that your requests are only being sent to the services that you want to be loaded. So it really helps you manage that cost element. But it is part of the ongoing process of managing your cloud workload. You do need to be managing those costs over time.
Great, thanks, James. Another one, as well as our clinical applications, we're looking to move other services into the cloud, for example, our on-site email servers. How would that fit in with load balancing? Aaron, I guess that's for you again.
Yeah, no problem. So the load balancers aren't just for healthcare applications, obviously. And I think a key point, people do ask this, is can you load balance many workloads on the load balancers at the same time? And the answer to that is yes. We load balance pretty much all TCP and UDP traffic. We have DNS load balancing as well, which can be used in some other more complex examples. As such, we can load balance pretty much anything you need to do. And as I say, you can do all of that on a single appliance if you need to.
Brilliant. Thanks, Aaron. And then we have one final question. We are considering deploying our applications into AWS. Why would we use Loadbalancer.org instead of AWS's native load balancers? Not sure who wants to take that one.
I can jump in again. I think there's many little reasons, and I think sometimes when you're looking to move your workload to the cloud, you might know that the inbuilt load balancer is not going to work. However, to highlight some of those things, cost is usually easier to work out. I mean, we're generally deploying a couple of virtual instances in the cloud, so you can quite easily figure out what the cost is going to be. With some of these services, depending on the cloud, you can be effectively nickel and dimed, and it can be quite difficult to understand how many rules you may be using, or however it's worked out in different environments. Throughput comes into it as well. James mentioned earlier, I think, that one of the benefits was the combination of having both layer 4 and layer 7 load balancing combined together. So rather than having to have, like it is an AWS and network load balancer doing the low level stuff, and you've got the application load balancer that handles all the HTTP layer 7 type traffic. You can have all of that combined in one thing. And I also mentioned we've got the GSLB function, and there's also WAF function as well built in. So you're getting a lot more than just a load balancer. You're getting a fully fledged application delivery controller.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Aaron. And one more that has just come in as you were answering that is, do we have a lot of experience in the healthcare sector? I think we've covered some of that, but James, would you like to come back on that one briefly?
Yes, certainly. So we've been working in the sector for around 10 years or so. We've showcased a number of the vendors that we work with, but it's important that we've got referenceability with our customer base in the hospitals themselves as well. So in the UK, working with an extensive number of NHS trusts, but everything from ambulatory care to large consortiums of hospitals in the US and globally as well. And it speaks volumes about support as well. I think that's an important piece to consider. We invest very heavily in support. We're very highly regarded from a customer reviews perspective and on Gartner. And that's where we really focus our efforts in support that is tierless. You're speaking to experienced engineers that understand these environments, not just the application or the load balancer itself, but the medical IT world.
Great stuff. Thank you. So those are all the questions. So I think the only thing that's left to do is to thank everybody that attended the webinar today. We're very grateful for your time. Yep, we will close things out there. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to hear from you in the very near future. Many thanks.